that he is to die, knows full well that he must die, and yet nevertheless, finally, I believe, approaches death with the conviction that therein he is finally being called to a yet deeper union with the incarnate Word, with the Word that is at the center of life and the body and death, and therein enters into a final union with that Word, not in a immortal, transcendent realm, but rather somehow, finally, in the center of everything that we know as life and energy.
Would you mind expanding on plenitude of being? I especially like that. It makes me think of a line in Paul Edwards' critique of Tillich's thought where he quotes Alice in Wonderland. The king meets someone on the road and says, has anyone gone along ahead of me? And the other fellow says, nobody. And the king says, that's impossible because I didn't see him on the road. This is an example of hypostasizing of language. One creates realities by the use of words. This is word magic, Professor Altizer, nothing but word magic. What in thunder is the plenitude of being?
Well, it's an established traditional theological category which you should know, sir.
I know the category. What I'm wondering is, what in thunder are you able to do in justifying it? Why is there any such plenitude of being, regardless of the long tradition that Ta'on has from Neoplatonic philosophy on up?
I, again, don't quite know what you're asking for.
Just tell me what you mean by the plenitude of being and justify your use of the expression.
Herein I mean the plenitude of being to refer to the fullness and the totality of God as God, of God as Lord. A totality which isolates God as God from the creation.
Where does your knowledge of either God or the creation come from so that you can define the term plenitude of being in this way?
Fundamentally, of course, the doctrine of God as the Creator is grounded in the Old Testament.
I thought that we had more or less gotten rid of this as any kind of normative base for determining such questions.
Quite to the contrary.
And then, of course, you have no objection to the ascent into heaven, since the ascent into heaven is the return of the Son to the Father who manifests this plenitude of being.
Well, you're misunderstanding everything that I stand for. I speak of a divine movement from spirit to flesh, of a divine negation of spirit. Now, there cannot be a self-negation of spirit unless there is a prior reality of spirit to be negated.
All right, how do we know that there was any prior reality of spirit?
Only in faith.
Why that rather than the toasted cheese sandwich deity that I suggested earlier?
Because this has been spoken of and made manifest and real in such a way as to be believable in faith.
And why has it been made believable in your understanding?
Quite simply because it's become manifest in history, in experience, in such a way as to be livable, to be real.
So is Marxism.
Of course, that's another question.
Why this rather than that?
I didn't repudiate Marxism.
It seems to me that the Marxists would be terribly unhappy with the understanding of the kenotic Jesus that you have presented. The Marxists would like to have such theological terminology removed, eliminated completely.
I don't think that's true.
You insist on the use of this terminology.
Not at all. The Marxist is Hegelian. Canonic language is Hegelian. That's another point.
Yes, I pointed that out, I think, in my critique, that this language is Hegelian. But Marx, you remember, turned Hegel on his head and insisted that in any dialectic process, solely material considerations would be the determining elements. Now, unless I'm mistaken,
dialectical, not in a positivistic sense.
Nonetheless, the determining elements in this dialectic happen to be material factors. Now, if you think that that's what the Old Testament is saying...
I didn't say that's what the Old Testament is saying.
All right, then you would disagree with the Old Testament in that particular.
I just repeat my former position, which is that God has emptied himself of that which he was when he was manifest to the Old Covenant as God.
Don't you see that you've made a complete circle? You're now back to the God of the Old Testament emptying himself. The point is, can we rely upon the Old Testament in its theology, in the presentation of God that it gives?
Of course we can. We can't understand the death of God unless we understand the God who dies. And we have to go to the Old Testament for that.
In other words, you wouldn't find that God apart from the Old Testament.
No.
And when we come to the New Testament, in which Jesus affirms that God has become manifest in him, and that he has died for the sins of the world, and his resurrection occurs, and he rises from the dead and ascends to the right hand of the Father, then we
Then we have a return to Old Testament faith, a reversal of the incarnation, and a regression to a pre-incarnate form of faith, yes. But it's bad faith. It returns to an empty form of Old Testament faith.
Why did Jesus botch it so
possible
badly?
only for the Jew, not for the Christian.
Why did Jesus botch it so badly when it came to the whole question of the ascension?
Jesus certainly did not teach that he would ascend into heaven.
Oh, really?
Certainly not.
According to the primary documents, which I think have got to take a little precedence over your judgments on them, 19 centuries later, in the book of Acts, at the beginning of the book of Acts, we have the assertion that Jesus ascended into heaven and said, in the same manner in which you see me go into heaven, so I will come again from heaven. The writer of the book of Acts is certainly the writer of the Gospel according to St. Luke, the third Gospel, and therefore we are in the midst of the primary documents of the Christian faith. Now, what's the trouble with the document at that point?
Well, there are innumerable problems here, of course, which I don't quite see how we can discuss. I mean, frankly, this is a strange kind of discussion for me. I'm just not accustomed to people who take such things as being the teachings of Jesus. This is all new to me.
Well, I can only conclude that 19 and a half centuries of church history are totally new to you, which is a strange thing for a theologian to say. What I'm presenting is not Montgomeryism. This happens to be the teaching of the ecumenical creeds maintained by all Orthodox Christians, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant, the position maintained by the Reformers, reiterated by Wesley, and on to the present. You're the one who's presenting the most bizarre and aberrational form of religion imaginable, and you have the gall to cloak it with the name of the Christian faith.
This is a sort of backfill question, I guess, maybe get at some of the crossfire we've been having. This is addressed to Dr. Montgomery. The reason the death of God is a gospel to Altizer is because the notion of a transcendent God is such a horror. Yet you said nothing about the concept of the transcendence of God. Will you please make up this deficit or lack?
Are you sure this isn't directed to Professor Altizer?
To you.
All right, let me have it once more.
What is your notion, in other words, of a transcendent God here?
The question is, what's my notion of a transcendent God? If the notion presented in the ecumenical creeds is grounded in the totality of scriptural revelation, that as a matter of fact, God is transcendent over the world. He is the creator of it out of nothing, and he preserves it by his grace. If he were to withdraw his hand in a moment, Altizer, Montgomery, and the whole gang here would go up in smoke. And in this sense, he is transcendent over his creation. He is not limited to it. One of the great errors of contemporary process theology, and Professor Altizer has close relations with this, as he himself pointed out at DePaul, is simply that God is bound to the creation in some way, such that the creation conditions God. Now, the notion of the creation conditioning God is a notion which simply can't be reconciled with the biblical position. God is transcendent over the creation, over his world, and he does with it as he wills. That God appeared in Jesus Christ in this world. And if he hadn't appeared in Christ, we would have very, very little knowledge of him.
I'm largely in agreement with that. That is to say, I think Dr. Montgomery has accurately spoken of what I understand to be the transcendence of God. But I'd like to make a further point. I think one of the interesting things that we can observe in the movement of history, and here I limit myself to Western history, specifically to Western Christendom, here in not speaking, for example, of Judaism, is that as our history has unfolded, as it has moved, we have increasingly known the transcendence of God in ever more empty and alien forms and images. So that by the time we come to the disintegration of Western Christendom, which really already occurs, most fundamentally perhaps the time of the French Revolution, certainly in the 19th century, the fruits of which we're living today, When we reach this point, it's no longer possible for Western man to know the transcendent God as a source of life or joy. Instead, transcendence appears either as a wholly alien, oppressive realm, or as a wholly abstract and empty realm. I think it's very interesting, for example, that in what many regard as our greatest American novel, Moby Dick, the transcendent God is known under the image of the white whale. Or, to move to the 20th century, perhaps the most profound spokesman of the reality of transcendence for us is Franz Kafka, in which we see a wholly negative, wholly destructive, repressive, alien form of transcendence. And I would say that the only form of transcendence which we can actually know, which we can live, is either an alien or an empty one, and it's precisely for this reason that the Christian can know the death of God as gospel, as joy, as liberation.
I think there's a lot to this that from the French Revolution on, approximately maybe the beginning of the 17th century, the movement away from transcendence, from meaningful transcendence, became stronger and stronger. But the answer to this is not the death of God. The answer to this is to go to the point in human history where God enters our realm and we can experience Him. And if one moves elsewhere in trying to solve this problem, one gets absolutely nowhere. And that's what contemporary Protestant theology has demonstrated. Karl Barth attempted to find God in the realm of Geschichte rather than Historia, and as a result of trying to do this, he got absolutely nowhere, because it's very difficult to identify resurrections or even poker games in Geschichte. This is a realm of suprahistory for which no criteria seem to exist. Rudolf Bultmann attempted to find God in internal experience, but it's very difficult to distinguish the Holy Spirit from stomach trouble, as Professor Altizer has so well demonstrated. Paul Tillich attempted to solve this problem in the realm of religious symbolism, and Professor Altizer reflects this also, where you have nothing but symbolic statements made about God. But if everything is symbolic, you've gotten nowhere. Finally, we get to the death of God, where no statements are made about the transcendent at all. This is what Wittgenstein talked about when he said that the proper function of philosophy is to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. Professor Altizer is flying around in this fly bottle along with most of contemporary Protestant theology. The fly bottle was created when Protestant theology lost its confidence in the historical records concerning the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And the only way out of this is the way the contemporary theologian got into it, to see that it's possible to deal with these records and find a Jesus who is both God and man there. Then you see the transcendent God manifest in the human situation. And in seeing this, you have your entree to the transcendent.
I'd like to interject here a comment. How do you really feel that Altizer has contradicted the historical thesis?
That would require an evening. The point is, and I think this became quite clear in the exchange that we had earlier, Professor Altizer abstracts from the New Testament documents those elements in Jesus' teachings which fit with the neo-Hegelian immanent spirit which is expanding in the world and creating dialectically the fulfillment which he looks for. For example, he is able to take the notion of Jesus as an eschatological figure. He has no trouble with this at all. But whenever he comes across material in Jesus' teachings which doesn't go along with this, then that material is immediately transferred to the realm of the incredible. And this is a deuce of a way of finding out what Jesus' teachings actually are in history. One has to put oneself at the disposal of the records, to allow the records to speak to the individual. One cannot stand over the records with the kind of critical selectivity that's being used here. The result of this always is that you get historical figures that are simply mirror images of yourself. Now, what we get here is not an historical Jesus or an objective Jesus. What we get here is a Jesus who remarkably ends up fitting precisely the theological presuppositions that Professor Altizer takes to the investigation to begin with. So we've learned nothing.
I would simply like to ask, do you really believe it's possible to construct a theological position which accepts the full authority of the Bible or of the New Testament and which does not inevitably rest upon a negation of certain materials present in the New Testament?
Not only do I think it's possible, I don't even have to do it. That's been done again and again through the history of the church. You can take Augustine, you can take...
Has it been done by anyone since the dawn of the modern historical consciousness?
Oh, I would say yes, very definitely.
For example?
Well, I hate to cite a theologian of my own tradition, but Franz Pieper's Christian Dogmatics is an example of this sort of thing. If you'd like something in a more literary vein, if you take the writings of C.S. Lewis, you will find in the writings of C.S. Lewis the comprehensive body of biblical teaching. Lewis doesn't stand over Scripture and pick and choose.
Oh, yes, he does. He certainly does.
For example?
For example, the apocalyptic Jesus is absent from Lewis.
I wouldn't say he was absent if I wanted to take into account some of his most important writings, which are his children's stories, for example, the Narnia Chronicles. In the seventh and final Narnia Chronicle, The Last Battle, you get an apocalypticism that transcends anything that a professional Protestant theologian has done in the 20th century. Yeah. Remember that tremendous passage where the farther in you go, the larger it becomes?
My ignorance. I haven't read those, but I shall.
You ought to. You ought to give them to your children to read. They're magnificent.
I'd like to address a question out of Dr. Altizer as he came in. This bothered me a little bit, too. Why is it just... I said this bothered me a little, too. Why is it just now, at this time in history, that the death of God has broken in upon the consciousness of the corporate Christian body? Why if this process is going on and on, why is it at just this particular juncture in history? Why not 100 years from now, another millennium?
By right now, I really mean a period of, it depends on what you mean by this. I really want to speak in terms of 200 years. I don't mean 1967. But, and it's a gradual thing, of course. I think, however, that there is one fundamental answer to this question. I really think that what underlies, historically speaking, our time, insofar as ours is a time of the death of God, is the collapse of Christendom. The breakdown of our traditional Christian culture and society. The breakdown of the church as the dominant bearer of culture, etc., etc. That in a time in which traditional Christian norms are no longer decisively operative throughout the human community or throughout interior experience, that therein, in a certain sense, a form of faith or of religion or of belief which could partially absorb the reality of Christ and nevertheless make possible a God language perpetuating a pre-incarnate form of Christ, once that breaks down, then in a certain sense, there is no barrier between man and the reality of the death of God. I mean, that's one explanation. I do think that what we call the death of God is unquestionably, integrally an expression of the collapse of Christendom. But there are many other ramifications to this.
Could I slip in a question here? You feel the death of God is a positive phenomenon, and therefore the 19th century appearance of this and the 20th century reinforcement of it is definitely a revelatory kind of experience. Maybe that isn't precisely language, but you feel that way. Yeah. Doesn't this suffer from that famous old fallacy of consensus gentium, that because things are going on, because people happen to take a particular point of view, that point of view is necessarily a good one? Why shouldn't we pick the 13th century as revelatory? It seems to me I read an interesting Thomist work once entitled The Greatest of Centuries, and of course this turned out to be the 13th century since it was the century of Thomas Aquinas. People in the Reformation tradition, such as I, tend to glorify the 16th century, the Reformation. Isn't there a real
Humanly possible,
danger here?
it's not possible to live in any century but our own.
You mean anything that happens to go on in our century is ipso facto an
Real
example of
for
the Spirit
us.
operating?
No, it's not necessarily, but this is our reality. This is our world. We can't live in another world. We have to live in the 20th century.
Oh, I agree, definitely. The question is, on what in the 20th century ought a positive valuation to be placed, and on what in the 20th century ought a negative evaluation to be placed?
I grant it.
Okay.
That's the crucial question in a certain sense.
Okay, how about a crucial answer?
Well, I think I've made my choice. I mean, I'm not disguising it, am I?
Oh, no, I'm not questioning that you've made a choice. I want to know, why one should choose as you have in regard to the phenomena of the 20th century. Why, for example, should you choose in the direction of the death of God phenomenon as you see it in the 20th century and choose against those historic Christian churches that are still maintaining the faith that was once delivered to the saints?
I frankly don't know of any such churches, to be perfectly honest with you.
I suggest that you move north. I think that's the answer.
I want to quit soon.
This question is addressed to Dr. Montgomery. I should like to ask if you attack Altizer for having a faith which is non-verifiable empirically, and please state how your Lord for our grandsons is empirically verifiable.
That man caught my rhetoric at the end of it. Yeah. The answer to this is simply the answer that is provided by the early Christian proclaimers of the gospel. They had personal, empirical contact with Jesus, and they found that this Jesus was not simply a man. He wasn't simply a man, he was more than this, and this was true in what he said and in what he did. He forgave sins, for example. People said to him, who can forgive sins but God only? And he didn't say, oops, you're quite right, it was a slip. He identified himself with the eternal God in the forgiving of sins. He performed miracles. He rose again from the dead. They had that kind of personal, empirical contact with him. We have documents reporting this, and these documents are primary documents. They were in circulation when people were still alive who had contact with these events. And many of those people were very hostile in their attitude toward the Christian faith. They would have destroyed this thing if it could have been destroyed, just as many false messiahs fell to the wayside. Theudas, who wanted to divide the Jordan River, for example, and various things of this kind. Under these circumstances, we have here the empirical testimony of those who saw Christ manifest his deity, rise from the dead, conquer the powers of death. And those who are Orthodox Christians, whatever their denominational connection, believe that this Christ who rose from the dead is exactly who he said he was. Certainly he was in a better position to make statements on the subject than we are. That's an empirical base which is solid. Now, it isn't 100% certain, no historical knowledge is, but neither is any knowledge of your present. You base your understanding of the world on your empirical contacts in the present, but you still have to act. And the evidence in this case is remarkable. And it's the kind of evidence that if a person will consider it seriously, he'll see the direction in which it goes. As Pascal said, there is enough evidence to convince anybody who is not set against it, but there is not so much evidence that a person is forced into it if he will not.
I think we'll have just one final question. I think our participants are getting quiet. This is one out of the video. This is to Dr. Altizer. Does the Jewish theologian Rubinstein believe God died in Jesus? If not, when does he believe God died? If he believes God died in Jesus, hasn't he left the Jewish stance before he joined the God is dead movement?
I don't think this is a good one to choose. I mean, who am I to speak for Dr. Rubinstein? I know him very well, and I've read many of his things. He does not believe that God died in Jesus. Of course not. He's a Jew. But, so what? If not, when does he believe God died? Rubinstein is grounded in the Kabbalah, in the Jewish mystical tradition. In a certain sense, he believed that God died in becoming the Creator, but this is a technical point. I can only say, read his book. It's a wonderful book, After Auschwitz. I'm no one to speak for his position. He's a very clear, forceful writer. You won't have any trouble in getting his position by reading it.
I'd be very interested in the dialogue sometime to hear the two of you battle out the question of whether God died in Jesus or whether he didn't.
Well, we've had many battles.
This problem of verifiability would come out with agonizing clarity in a discussion like that, because neither of you would be able to say anything.